Hey folks, Doug Blake with Body Design University. We are educational partners with the National Academy of Sports Medicine, or NASM. And what we're going to do is go over the exam blueprint and study guide for the 7th edition right now. And so if you have not done so, you got to get yourself, obviously, the NASM 7th edition. It's a little bit different than the 6th edition. They've done a lot of neat updates, made it a lot simpler, easier. Ironically enough, it's a little bit thicker than the 6th edition, but I actually like the 7th better. They've made things a lot easier, a lot more engagement sensitive for the student, and so it's an upgrade for sure from the 6th edition. Remember, for the most part, the testing is going to be very similar, but the goal here today, as I go through this basic study guide with you, is to help you to understand the most common questioning and areas of study that are seen most, or what we call represented on the actual NASM exam. So if you haven't done so, you can get your BDU study guide. We call this an exam blueprint study guide, and basically what this is going to do for you is sort of hone your study efficiency, study time into those specific areas that we know are most represented on the NASM test. So just real quick, to kind of give you a sort of an overview of what it is you're trying to do when you sit down for one of these exams. NASM has a 120 question, and by the way, not all of those questions are being counted towards your actual grade. However, you're not going to know. They're research questions, and they're always being used so that NASM can make the future tests better and more appropriate to the study material. So they're always doing research on which questions are good, which questions wouldn't work, and why people do well or do worse on certain questions. So they have, I think it's up to about 20 of those 120 questions, something like that, are research questions. But remember, you don't know which ones are research and which ones are not. So you're taking a 120 question exam. They give you 2 hours to do it, and that's all you're concerned about. But here's a couple of things, like I said, to ensure you really understand kind of the point behind studying a specific way. Look, if you can get 2 months, even up to 3 months of actual study time in the textbook, study guides, as well as the what we offer, the chapter by chapter study guides, you're going to basically have everything you need along with practice exams, but to really get the material stuck into your brain well enough to answer the multiple choice tests that they have for you. But there are a couple little tips and tricks we want to go over with you, particularly if you don't have all that time to study. Now, just keep in mind, if you don't have a month, 2 months to study, you're just basically going to do the best you can. And so what you have to always keep in mind when it comes to studying techniques, first thing you got to know is, how much actual time do you have to study? Do you have an hour a day to study? Some of you may have 2 hours a day. Okay. I don't recommend sitting down for 2 hours at a time. I recommend that you actually break that study time up into multiple times of engagement. Remember, ultimately, the more you expose yourself to the material on a frequency basis, we call it exposure frequency to the materials, the better chance you're going to have at memorizing the material. In other words, if you had a choice, if you could do it, I'm not saying you can do it, but if you could do it, you are much better off spending 1 hour a day broken into 2 30-minute study sessions than studying 1 hour a day, just straight out 1 hour, because your retention is just not as good after a certain amount of time. So I always recommend, if you can get 15 minutes, 20 minutes, up to a half hour in the morning, and then maybe sometime later in the day, afternoon or evening, do the same thing, that would be preferable. But again, scheduling is going to be the big issue for you. So keep in mind, seventh edition exam blueprint study guide. From that study perspective, do what you can do. The more time you have, obviously, the better you'll probably do on the exam. The seventh edition has a lot of conveniences inside the textbook to help you to memorize more pertinent information. And then what I'm going to go through with you right now is how we have essentially taken this material and put it into a format and given the most important information that we know is going to be on the exam. Please understand, there's no study guide. There's no way to study that's going to magically help you pass the exam. NASM has multiple exams that they use and run through on a regular basis. So if you take an exam on Monday, let's just say you don't pass it. If you don't pass it, but you take the exam again the next week, next Monday, or even 5 or 6 days later, or even 2 weeks later, you're not going to take the same exam. In fact, that exam is probably going to look very different than the first one you took. And then if you had to take a third one, so this is the way it'll be very different. Because they have multiple exams, they want to make sure that you know the material. But once again, we know where those pockets of material are located, and that's what we're going to go through. Remember, this study guide is not a specific study guide that's going to teach you every little bit of every concept and word that's in the book. That's what the textbook is for. The study guide is to help you in a very general way to guide you to those areas that you should be spending a whole lot more time in. And we'll get into that. So 7th edition, I'm just going to put that book over there, and we can actually get into the study guide itself. And what I would like you to do is to always keep in mind that from a studying perspective, always have a sheet of paper. I always have lined paper. So I got a notebook, for instance, that has lined paper in it. And I'm going to be reading, rewriting it over and over and over. That's going to definitely help your retention and your memorization. What I also do is I also use, or I like to use, just plain old. You can see my printer back here. I just grab printer paper, and that's what I use to draw things. So I can sketch and draw. Just keep in mind, the goal when it comes to studying is to actually study. A lot of folks think that reading is studying. In reality, reading is not studying. Reading is the very beginning, the first part, especially when it comes to sort of technical information. You've got to read it. Reading has a very low retention association. So just reading something, you're not going to remember a whole lot of what you read. So reading is the beginning or starting point for the actual memorization process and the learning process. Okay, so memorization, learning, they're kind of interchangeable in one sense. You got to apply it, of course, but we're talking about specifically to pass the NASM exam and pass it on the first shot. So I like to keep just writing paper where I can scribble and draw anything that will assist with the physicality of writing, and that's going to aid retention. The last thing, of course, is when you're reading and rewriting concepts and definitions, say it out loud. If you speak it out loud, your audiological component of memorization, when you hear something, particularly if you're a audiological learner, if that's your primary learning style, it's definitely going to help. So really all you're doing is getting all these different modalities of memorization in at the same time. So you read, yeah, you can memorize a little bit, right? So. But if you rewrite that same thing that you read, you're going to memorize it all. You're going to have a much higher retention level, almost 3 times higher than just reading it alone. If you were to then say it out loud, okay, and say, a Lamborghini is a type of car, you'll memorize that better than if you just read it on a sheet of paper. You'll retain that information better if you read it and rewrite it, because if you rewrite it and say it out loud, you get this other point of engagement for learning memorization, and that's the listening or audiological. So keep that in mind. You want to make your study time efficient. I know, boy, before I ever learned how to really study, I would get so frustrated because I'd read through. I even used highlighters, which I don't use anymore, and I don't recommend that you use them because, again, that's not studying, that's reading, right? You're just putting colors on there. And people say, well, it allows me to go back and look through, but guess what you're probably going to do again with a highlighter? You're going to highlight it, you're going to read, poor retention, and then you're going to go back and say, oh, okay, well, that's the highlighted material. Let me read that again. And what did you do? Nothing. You poor retention. So I don't normally, if that works for you, absolutely use what works. But you got to remember, what works is what helps you to pass the exam. So just keep that in mind, and that's why we're going through this. So I don't use highlighters, but what I did learn was that I was getting so frustrated that I had to figure out a better way to ensure that the short amount of time I had to go through materials, whatever the course was that I was studying, I had to make it efficient. So I didn't want to have to keep going back over. And you know how it is. You start reading, and then after a while, you're like, oh, and you don't even realize that you just read through a page. Now you got to go back and reread it. And I know for many of you, I'm talking right at you, and you're sitting there laughing because you know what I'm talking about. So we want to make it efficient, and that's how you do it. So the point of the study guide, these precision study tips, right off the bat, we've got some bullet points for you. And look, there's an ideal scenario here. It's ideal if you could every day be consistent. And by the way, consistency on a daily basis is really the most effective way to study. You got to, that frequency of exposure to the material is generally what puts it into your mid and then ultimately your long-term memory. You'll be dreaming about the stuff. So again, study every day for at least an hour. We do recommend using our Quizlet study app that you can get onto and use. Quizlet's a great study app because of its different modalities of learning the material. Okay, if you've never used it, you got to go on there. It's really, really quite excellent, a study resource. We do have a NASM study group on Facebook. It's the largest on Facebook, and we highly recommend you go in there. If you haven't gotten there, or you're not a member of that group, we highly recommend you get in there because I think there's over 10,000 other NASM students, people that are studying at some point along the way that are constantly asking questions, and you may find a question or you can ask a question in there as well. And there's other resources in there as well. Now, the other thing to keep in mind, and again, there's an ideal way to do these things. If you don't have the time to do it, then you just have to pass over that and do the best you can. But ideally, you should read through the NASM textbook at least once. Now, let me show this to you because it's always a point of confusion for folks when I say read through. That's a big textbook, right? Or it looks like a big textbook. Trust me, it's I'm not going to say it's a lot less, but from a reading perspective, it's a lot less. So I want to show you real quick what I mean. We use the term peruse, P-E-R-U-S-E, or a single perusal through the textbook. And what I'm saying is that when you do this initial run through, you've never seen this before. You've never studied this material before. One of the best ways to make your subsequent study time effective is to have some, exposure, minor but general exposure to the material. And that's what the first perusal is designed for. So all I do is I just come through and I don't need the user's guide yet. Okay, I get to section 1. And as long as there is written material, I'm going to read through and I'm not going to stop. Don't stop and go, oh, I guess I don't know what that is. Don't do that. The perusal is just that. A perusal is a time-sensitive tactic, okay? It's time-sensitive. You're not trying to learn anything through that perusal. If you don't have a month to do your studies, And don't do the perusal, you just move right through. But if you actually have the ideal scenario where you can spend time studying through this materials, trust me, an initial perusal of the material is one of the best things, because you know what it does for you? It allows you, or allows your brain, you don't even realize it sometimes, it allows your brain to basically see two things: the things you know or have heard or are somewhat familiar with, and those you're not. The tendency is to stop and try and learn the stuff that you don't know. For instance, right off the bat, you open this up and you're going to do your perusal, and you see welcome to NASM obesity, and you don't even know what obesity, let's just say you don't know what obesity is, or you don't know what kinesiology or whatever it is. The tendency is to stop and go, oh man, I better, oh my goodness. No, don't, you got to fight the urge. Don't worry about it. Read through it. What your brain basically is going to do is it's going to throw that term or that information into a bucket. By the way, once it's in that little bucket, it'll be retrievable when you go back to actually study those areas, because now you're going to say to yourself, pretty much, I already know a lot of this. I don't need to spend time on it once you get through your actual in-depth study. But the perusal is not designed for that. The perusal is, oh, I don't even know what obesity is. Well, I'm going to read through. I read through. When you get to figures, don't look at them. Read the written material, what we call copy, okay? Copy is the term for text. So if you ever hear me say that, if you hear anybody say, you know, we need to update the copy or we need to check the copy, that's what we're talking about. Just read the copy, the text. Don't read the sidebars. Don't read then it will take you forever to do your first run through perusal. But if you do it the way I'm explaining it to you, you're going to read through the text. Most of it you may or may not even know, but go through it. Don't spend a whole lot of time on any part of this that's not written material. And you read through, very interesting information. That's great. Move on. You'll notice that as I'm moving through, don't read any, this is your first run perusal. Don't read any of your boxes. Don't read your training tip box. Don't, by the way, it's great information, but not on the first run through. Training tips, stretch your knowledge box. You'll notice that literally half, if not more, of these pages, and little tip here for you, half the book is not even written material. That's what I'm saying. They've actually made it simpler. Thank you, NASM. If you look at, you know, page 7, just as a for instance, you'll notice that it's a chart. It's a chart. Okay, that's really cool. Get through it. Don't read the critical box. Don't read the stretch your knowledge. Don't read those. Read the text. It's going to start opening up your brain to the stuff you know, okay, and the stuff you don't know. And so as you're going through it, I know that there's some really cool pictures that they got. I know there's a table. Oh my God, I'm gonna have to, don't do it. Read the text. You read the text, move on. Read the text. If you're a speed reader, you'll be done in like 3 days. Okay. You know, I can basically read through this in a week, an hour or two a day, whatever the case is. I'm reading through, and I'm exposing my brain to stuff I already know because I'm perusing through it, quick overview, and the stuff that I don't know. And when I start seeing stuff I don't know, I'm going to say, okay, well, I guess I'm going to be spending a lot of time in chapter, whatever the case is. And yeah, that's going to be the situation. So you do your perusal through, you'll get through. They've got a lot of exercises in some of these further chapters. They're just pictures of technique, and they're great. Look at this, 2 pages of nothing but, you're not even reading, you're not even going through this. You don't read the technique box again. So that's going to be your first. I mean, look, even if you stop the video at this point, you actually now know more than most people do when it comes to studying. And it's kind of the idea. And by the way, you can use this technique with anything you do. If you're going to college, if you're in high school, it doesn't matter. If you're in grad school, it doesn't matter. Use the technique that I'm showing you here. It is, it's helped a lot of people. It's what I do myself personally. With anything that I'm trying, that's what I do. And I set things up on my desk. That's what I want you to do. Get yourself set up in a nice little area that you can have your writing material, your textbook, and your study guide. So those are some of your precision study tips. Your second run through of the text is going to be a lot slower, more methodical. We do recommend that when you're doing the next run through, use the chapter by chapter study videos that we have as well, where basically I spend a lot more time on each individual chapter for every chapter. Okay, so we highly recommend that. And then after you study the materials, we have then 3 practice exams. Keep this in mind. Practice exams are a critical strategic study tool. You've got to do this in a very specific way to maximize your studying efficiency. First and foremost, take the test. Don't wait, and don't try and pass with a high grade your practice exams. That's not your goal. Your goal is to pass them, but your first goal, first and foremost, is to do them so that you can now be exposed to the questions and why you got them wrong. That's the key to a study test or study exam, practice exam. Your goal is to study those areas in the materials. If you missed a question, that's when you're going to go back to the textbook. That's when you're going to go back to for instance, the chapter by chapter study guides. That's when you go into the Facebook group and you put a question. Why did I get this wrong? What can somebody help me with this? Just as a for instance, okay? Remember, you can always talk to you can always call your success coaches as well, because they're NASM certified, so you can talk to them as well. So that's kind of the point. Practice exam, study, target study. Second practice exam, knock it out. It's a completely different test. It's a completely different test, but guess what? The materials are all percentage from those domains the same, and I'm going to go over that in a second. Do the second, same thing, study, target study. Then do your third one. Do that third one. It's going to be a different one, different test, different questions. Okay. And do the same thing. After you do those 3, believe it or not, you actually should be able to sit for the actual NASM exam after that, with a little bit more touch-up, brushing up on certain areas, things like that. So those are your precision study tips. Keep in mind the following as you go through this study guide. This is really important. For the most part, it'll kind of set the groundwork to help you understand why we talk about certain chapters as being high priority, moderate, and low priority. Because the way NASM does this is they take all of the material in the book and they break all of that material into informational or study domains. There are 6 of them. Basic applied sciences, and basically what they're doing is they're taking all the information that is conceptually the same, right? So if it's applied sciences and nutritional concepts, any chapter that has that information is going to be grouped into this thing called Domain 1. Domains are not chapters. Chapters are not domains. Domains are conceptual aggregates of information, right, that have a number of chapters associated with them. Okay. Chapters are specific conceptual groupings of material, and multiple chapters, for the most part, fit into a single domain. So there's 6 domains, 23 chapters. Just keep that in mind. So when you're studying, and again, if you only got 2 weeks to do this, you're going to go and you're going to prioritize. Remember, you got to prioritize. If you only have 2 weeks to study and you've never seen this material before, you're basically honing in on 5 chapters in this entire textbook, because that's where the majority of the questions are going to be asked. And I'll explain that in a second. So the goal here, look at your domains. And this is the key, is that each domain has a certain number of questions on the 120 question test. So for instance, domain 1 has about 18 questions from domain 1. Now remember, domain 1 is chapters 5 through 10. So let's just say you didn't study anything but chapters 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10, right? That's domain 1. You knew it backwards and forwards, front and back of your hand. You got chapters 5 through 10 down pat. Technically, you should be able to get at least 18 questions correct on the test. That's basically what that's saying. So domain 1 has approximately 18 questions within it. By the way, this is one of the reasons why people get confused. Students will take the test, and then if they don't pass and they take it the second time, they're like, these are completely different. Well, no. It's all from chapters 5 through 10. But remember, there's a lot of material. I don't know where chapter 5 is. There's chapter 5, chapter 7, okay? There's a lot of information right in here between 5 through 10. Just keep that in mind. So there's lots of potential questions that they could ask. So domain 2 are client relations and be now, and this is one of the reasons why it's important to look at this, because it can help you focus your study time. There's about 18 questions in domain 2, but domain 2 is 2 chapters. So think about it. Chapters 5 through 10, a lot of material in chapters 5 through 10, and there's roughly 18 questions. Chapters 3 and 4 have the same number of questions. So where are you going to spend your study time? You're going to spend a lot of time in 3 and 4, just as a for instance. So just keep that in mind. Domain 3, assessments, okay? There's 19 questions, right? All of these have roughly about 20 questions. That's chapters 11 and 12. So now again, think about it. Inside of chapters 3 and 4, 11 and 12, inside of 4 chapters. Now think about this. Inside of 4 chapters, you have almost 10, 20, you have almost 35 to 40 questions in 4 chapters. Look at domain 1. In 5 chapters, you only have 20. In these 4 chapters, you have 40. So think about the way you're going to establish your study time and your priorities. In an ideal situation, you study everything. In a not so ideal situation, which is where I think most folks are, you're looking and going, I don't need to study chapter 1. I don't need to study chapter 23 because they're lower priority. I'm going to hone in on these 4 or 5 chapters. Domain 4 is program design. 24 questions from 3 chapters. I hope this is making sense. I want you to stop before you do anything and really get an idea of how you are going to pass this test if you are not in an ideal situation. Domain 5 is 30 questions from chapters 13 through 20, and then roughly 12 questions from chapters 1 and 2. Again, it's not that chapters 1 and 2 are not important. It's just that if you didn't study chapters 1 and 2 at all, if you didn't go through but you studied everything else and did well, you'd still pass the test relatively easy, because remember, that's only 12 out of 120 questions. So really important. Keep those things in mind. That's how we know and understand that certain chapters are low or high priority. So chapter 1, I'm starting off here. Chapter 1, chapters 1 and 2 are low priority chapters. The modern state of health and fitness and the personal training profession. They're basically introductory chapters, okay? So that's what they are. That's why they are low priority. However, they have some really good general information. So evidence-based practice, some of these concepts, acute chronic disease, you're going to see these later on in the subsequent chapters, and they're going to delve deeper and deeper and deeper into them, and you're going to really need to know them. So if you had a good idea of what they were beforehand, that would help you in your subsequent studying. So it's a these are 2 low priority chapters, and we've given you kind of the breakdown of those most pertinent pieces of material that are represented on the exam. So once again, keep in mind, the material that you're seeing right here is what we know is most probably represented on the exam. Doesn't mean that everything on here is on the exam in a question, but it means that the chances are really good that if anything from this chapter is going, they might only ask literally one question from chapter 1. They might only ask 3 questions from chapter 1 but then ask 9 questions on chapter 2. Remember, that domain is only 12 questions, and it contains chapters 1 and 2, right? 12 questions, 2 chapters. NASM doesn't have to ask 6 questions from chapter 1 and 6 from chapter 2. They can ask nothing from chapter 1, and all 12 questions would come from chapter 2. You don't know. I don't know. But what we do know is that they're more than likely, if they were going to ask questions from chapter 1, this is them about this material. So the basic concepts here are scope of practice and some chronic diseases. Chapter 2 is going to be on, basic employment issues, sales, rapport, right? The concept of rapport. For some of these are just basic concepts. Those are low priority chapters, remember. Now you're going to get to chapters 3 and 4 are moderate, which means that there are other chapters that you'll definitely want to put first on your study schedule list, but then these guys need to be in there. You don't want to not study these materials. And chapter 3 is the psychology of exercise. And some of the issues that you need to be considering here are sports exercise psychology definitions. What is motivation? Intrinsic, extrinsic motivation, common barriers to exercise. I would circle that. Lack of time, unrealistic goals, lack of social support, social physique anxiety. Okay, so these are the things that if you're going to look at chapter 3, when you go through chapter 3 and you're going, oh man, there's so much. No. That's what this is. This is for. Oh, I better look at common barriers and now read through that. Rewrite. Okay, some of the stuff is just probably not going to be on the test, but a lot of this stuff here that you see in this study guide, that's where you're going to focus. So unrealistic goals, social physique, anxiety, these are barriers to exercise. Very important part of chapter 3. The different types of support also as well. So what type of support do people need and what are they? Social support, instrumental support. You need to know if you're given an example of, John wants to go to the gym and his friend Bill drives him there 3 days a week. What type of support is that? It's instrumental support, tangible things, right? Providing transportation. Those you got to know. Chapter 4 is behavioral coaching. Okay, so knowing professionalism, and what are the things that are entailed when we say professional, right? Being a professional, those are things you need to know. Program design. So again, a lot of this is general. They're not going to hone in too deep yet. Self-efficacy, you need to know the definition. Now remember, if it's a definition, you need to read it and rewrite it, say it out loud, so it just pops in your head. As soon as you see anything related to self-efficacy, right, that it is self-confidence in achieving goals and accomplishing tasks. Affective judgments, subjective norms. This concept is impacting a person's readiness to perform resistance training. Stages of change, again, one of those things that is just paramount. You must know the 5 stages of change: pre-contemplation, contemplation, preparation, action, maintenance, and what they look like. What it is, if a person speaks to you or answers questions in a way, what stage of change are they? Active listening, motivational interviewing and how that can help you as a trainer, behavioral change techniques, cognitive strategies. Some of these things are really, really important because if they're going to ask questions, that's going to be on it. SMART goals, you need to know what SMART, what that stands for: specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and timely. The idea of starting with long-term or bigger goals and then developing a series of smaller or mini goals, right? Chapter 5 is again, a moderate priority chapter. This is the chapter on the nervous, muscular, and skeletal systems. Again, this is a lot of memorization because basically it's going through some basic anatomy. So the nervous system and the human movement system, which is the HMS, which is those 3 systems. nervous, skeletal, and muscular. And then all of the basic definitions and concepts that go along with each of those systems. So in the nervous system, you've got the muscle spindle and the Golgi tendon organ. Now keep in mind, this listing right here, these things are all critically important in chapter 5 on the nervous, skeletal, and muscular system. So you need to know osteokinematics. You need to know synovial joints. You need to understand why synovial joints are important. What's the structure of a synovial joint? This is what's going to help you to hone in inside the textbook. What is a myofibril? What is a sarcomere? All of those concepts need to be read and memorized. Excitation, contraction, coupling. The all or nothing principle describes basically how a motor unit either maximally contracts or doesn't. That's the all or nothing principle. Again, you will see questions that will say something like, when a muscle contracts maximally or does not contract is called what? And it's going to give you a bunch of, right? It's the all or nothing principle. What are motor units? They are single nerve cell and all the muscle fibers that single nerve cell innervates. What does afferent and efferent nerve means, right? Afferent is the nerves that take information from the muscles and send it to the spinal column. Efferent are motor neurons that take stimuli from the spinal column and send it back to the muscle. So type 1, type 2 muscle fibers, okay? Chapter 6, again, moderate priority. This is going to be on the cardiovascular, endocrine, and digestive systems. The key here, and this is one of the reasons why I always have some paper to draw with, it's not like they're going to ask you, name the 4 chambers of the heart. Probably not. NASM is not as much concerned about your memorization of structural anatomy. They're not as concerned about that. However, knowing the heart, for instance, if I can draw a picture of the heart and the atria on top, ventricles on the bottom, left on this side, right on this side, where does the blood go? Circulatory, systemic circulation, and pulmonary circulation. Take you 10 seconds to draw that out. Once you draw it out, you'll pretty much memorize it. I mean, it's really not a lot to memorize. And it's that drawing process that really is going to help you. You got to know stroke volume. It's the amount of blood pumped out of the left ventricle on every beat, right? So every time the left ventricle goes through a systolic or systole, right, a certain number of milliliters of blood goes out through the aorta. Okay, that's called stroke volume. If you total up all the stroke volumes in a minute time, you have what's known as cardiac output. See, these are just definitions. You got to go over this over and over. Arteries take blood away from the heart. Veins bring them back. Capillaries is where the exchange of gases, oxygen and carbon dioxide occur. Respiratory rate, some of these other basic definitional terms. And by the way, one of the things NASM did a great job with, by the way, is they gave you sidebars. These sidebars have all these definitions right there for you. You really don't have to think about it a whole lot, okay? They give you the sidebar because what they're saying is inside the text, we're bolding a term and we're going to put the definition of that right in the sidebar to get you to look at it, read it, and rewrite it. They did a great job with that. It's very helpful. And that's basically what we're going through here. You need to know certain endocrine system hormones like cortisol, insulin, glucagon, testosterone, obviously growth hormone. You don't need to know the biochemical structure. You just need to know what their basic function is. Okay, are they anabolic? What does insulin do? It lowers blood sugar levels. What does glucagon do? It elevates blood sugar levels. What does cortisol do? It's an anti-inflammatory. What does testosterone do? It's an anabolic androgenic agent. Those are the things that you can very, very easily move through. The other thing that NASM did, which again makes this relatively simple to navigate through, is they give you a lot of tables, a lot of charts that really help to move the information into a very simple, structured format. Again, very, very simple right, to navigate. Now, the memorization process is you got to rewrite them over and over, but to navigate through it and to be given that material into a table is really very convenient. Chapter 7 is, again, this is human movement science, and it is, again, it's a moderate priority chapter. Ironically enough, NASM doesn't put, you know, a ton of emphasis on knowing anatomy and some terminology associated with with physiology. They do want you to know certain things for sure, and that's what we're getting here. Planar movement, you got to know the sagittal, frontal, and transverse planes, and the terms that go along with it. Sagittal plane, flexion, extension, dorsiflexion, plantar flexion. Okay, these are terms that you need to know. Frontal plane, abduction, adduction, inversion, eversion, transverse plane, rotation, right? Those are the things you need to know for those particular planar movements. Osteokinematics, open and closed chain movements, right? Open and closed chain movements, meaning are the hands stable and the body is moving like in a push-up or a squat, or are the hands moving or the feet are moving like in a bench press, right? A bench press or leg extension, something, you know, those are two examples of open and closed. And so you got to know those. Force coupling, same thing. You got to know and be able to conceptualize this idea of the movement of the scapula or the pelvis under multiple muscles in different positions, creating single fluid rotational movements. The global muscular system versus the local muscular system. Know the difference between that. Lever systems, first, second, and third class. Proprioception, right? Intrinsic awareness of movement, body position. Important to know that. And what are the type of proprioceptors that we're concerned about? They're called mechanoreceptors, muscle spindle fibers, Golgi tendon organs. See, you can Google proprioception and you will see a plethora of information, but you don't care about, you know, pressure sensors and heat and cold sensors. We're concerned about the mechanoreceptors. Those are the nerves located in joints and in and around the muscles, right? So muscle spindle fibers in the muscle, Golgi tendon organs in the tendinous area. Motor learning, the integration of motor control processes, practice and experience. If you write down motor learning, and by the way, it's a sidebar definition in that chapter. Chapter 8 is exercise, metabolism, bioenergetics. Ironically enough, this is a low priority chapter. It's really interesting because it's not that it's actually some of the most incredible information, really good information that you probably want to use a lot in the real world, but on the testing, they don't have a whole lot of that material on your test. So you can, but again, it has nothing to do with the quality or the importance of the material. All we're talking about is how well this material is represented on the test. This is like my favorite information grouping right here. Personally, I mean, this is the coolest stuff ever. But if there's only 3 questions from chapter 8 or 1 question from chapter 8 on the test, on a 120 question test, guess what I'm not reading a whole lot of or spending a whole lot of time reading if I only got 3 weeks to take my test, just as a for instance. Chapter 8, I'm going to take my test, pass it, and then I'm going to come back later and open my book and really delve in and really interesting information. So chapter 8 is going to specifically talk to you about ATP, adenosine triphosphate, fundamental energy molecule, high phosphate energy molecule, and the different ways that ATP can be produced in the 3 separate systems, the ATP PC system for producing ATP, glycolysis, and oxidative phosphorylation, which is the Krebs cycle in the electron transport chain, electron transport system. And that's what that level of explanation is going to take you to. It's not going to go into it too in depth, right? It's not a anatomy phys class, but you do need to know the different systems for producing ATP and how long they provide ATP for during exercise. So the ATP PC system generates ATP on a continuous basis for up to about 15 seconds inside of a working muscle. And if the muscle is still working, it's got to shift over into glycolysis, anaerobic glycolysis without oxygen. Anaerobic glycolysis is going to provide energy for roughly, depending on the person, depending on the activity, could be up to about 2 minutes. Again, depending on how you train, could be up to 2 minutes. If you keep working after 2 minutes, roughly thereabouts, your body now has to shift into another mode of energy production. In other words, we got to get another way to produce ATP. And the way the body is going to do that is it's going to start to utilize oxygen in what's known as an aerobic ATP producing pathway, and that's known as oxidative phosphorylation. A number of different ways that ATP is produced ultimately from glucose or free fatty acids, whatever the case is. And so that is the third. That's going to provide ATP. It's going to provide energy ad infinitum as long as there's substrate, i.e. glucose or fat. And as long as there's oxygen available, that system just keeps producing ATP forever. Okay. Of course, you're going to fatigue at some point. You're not going to be able to get enough energy, enough substrate, or whatever the case is. That's what Chapter 8 is going to help you to really understand. Low intensity exercises versus high intensity. Where is the energy usage coming from? Fats versus glucose. Calories. Basic definition of calories. Resting metabolic rate. And nutritional related information within the bioenergetics paradigm. So non-exercise activity, thermogenesis. They're not difficult really to understand what they are. You just gotta write them down and memorize them. Chapter 8 is low priority. Chapter 9 back up to relatively moderate because it's on nutrition. It's the only chapter on nutrition. Big thing here is scope of practice, knowing the difference between what you can do and what other clinical practitioners could do. Proteins, carbs, fats, know the calories that go along with each, 449, carbs, protein, fats, 449, 4 calories per gram, 4 calories per gram, 9 for fat, 7 for alcohol, right, if you wanted to know that. And the RDA for protein is a minimum, some of the numbers like 0.8 grams of protein, right, just under 1 gram for every kilogram of body weight. Considered a minimum, right? That's the number. So when you see the question on the test, that's the answer they want you to give. Glycemic index, as well as the glycemic load. This is critical information that you've got to know, because they're going to ask you a question. They're going to ask a very realistic question about, well, somebody is eating potatoes versus somebody's eating, a cupcake. One has a high glycemic index, one has a low, which would be preferential for the overall length of time it takes for glucose to get into the blood, something like that. Well, you got to know glycemic index, right? The higher the glycemic index, the faster it gets converted into glucose in your blood system. Doesn't matter what the food is. Doesn't matter. If it has a high glycemic index, like a lot of fruits have a very high glycemic index, doesn't mean they're unhealthy or healthy. That's not what glycemic index tells you. It basically tells you how fast a particular food substance that contains carbohydrates gets converted into glucose. How long does that take from the time you eat it compared to a reference standard, which is glucose itself. Explanation of some vitamins and minerals, some hydration information. If you're going to spend time, it would be on the hydration component. And how much fluid should you replace? 1.25 times the amount of body weight. If you lose 1 pound of body weight from the beginning of your event to the end of the event, you need to consume 1.25 times the amount of body weight in fluid ounces. So you're going to have to now consume that much. So hydration guidelines, food labels. This is a big thing nowadays, is being able to read food labels for some reason. So it's important to read food labels. How many questions they're going to ask, but again, If they are going to ask questions, these are the questions they're going to ask. So that's why you can focus on it. So fat loss, net caloric deficit. Chapter 10 is supplements. Again, the thing about supplementation in this chapter is that NASM has to give you some information on it. The problem, of course, in the real world is that by the time you get the book, by the time you read a study guide, it's already out of date. There's certain things that will never go out of date with supplementation. If you drink coffee like I do, you never have to worry about coffee somehow or another from an ergogenic standpoint going out of practice. It's caffeine. It's always been around. It still is one of the most powerful ergogenic aids, and probably will be because it doesn't cost any, right? It's a cup of coffee, right? So the idea is that they have to give you information, a chapter information on the latest information they have. Read through it because it's interesting if you don't already know. There's about 50 other different supplements right now out there. I'm not saying they are effective or good or whatever the case is. I'm just saying they're out there. And NASM's not going to speak to every one of them. Now, what they do for you is they do tell you the main supplements that have been research validated. Creatine is a well-validated supplement. It actually does what it says it's supposed to do, which is to volumize muscle cells. It does have ergogenic properties. So that's what they talk about, and they explain it to you, which is great. Asking you on a test, not so much. So that's why you can see chapter 10 right here is pretty small as far as the study goes. So chapter 11. Okay, so now you take a step back. This is where you now go, okay, chapter 11, 12, 13, 14, and why? Because this is about the training. And 15. Okay, so chapters 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. Those are high priority chapters. Remember what we said in the very beginning. Chapters 11 and 12, that's almost 20 questions just from those two chapters. So just keep that in mind as you go through this. Normally, if you've got a week to get ready, 2 weeks to get ready, less than a month to get ready, you're taking this study guide out and you are literally going right to chapter 11, and this is where you're starting your studies. And you're sitting here with your textbook and this, and you're going back to memorize, learn, memorize as much as you can from these chapters, okay? Because chapter 11, health, wellness, it's all about assessments. Chapter 12, assessments. Chapter 13, the OPT training model, the optimum performance training model. That is NASM's, right, trademark branded way or programming methodology. Flexibility, chapter 14, okay? Cardiorespiratory training, chapter 15. Come on, that's personal training in a nutshell, right? Outside of the nutrition and the business, that's personal training. And so knowing assessments, understanding static postural, dynamic postural, that's basically all this anthropometric measures. Now you're honing in on these very specific assessment tests. You need to know all of them because you don't know which ones they're going to put on the test. So what are assessments? What is the PAR-Q plus, right? What is the health history questionnaire? What's the difference between the two? Resting and exercising heart rate. Anthropometric measures, body fat assessments. Do you do body fat first or do you do this screening test first? Those are the things you need to know. So you got to do your cardiorespiratory assessments, VO2 max testing, the 3-minute step test. What are they? Who is it designed for? Should you do the Rockport walk test with a 25-year-old athlete? No, it's not meant for that. You're going to do the 3-minute step test with them. You're going to do sub-maximal testing for ventilatory threshold. And that's what they're going to go through. It's really important. The talk test, the VT1 test, incremental test, VT2 test. You're not going to do that with everybody, but it's something you do need to know. Chapter 12 now is the postural movement patterns and performance assessments. So again, we're dealing with this initial information that you've got to gather from your client. NASM is big on knowing everything you need to know prior to developing an actual training program. Don't just throw people on a bench press. Don't just have them do squats. out of nowhere because they walk in and they're feeling good. But oh, no, 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 no. Do your assessments. Get all of this preliminary data and information first, then set up the program, and then make your necessary modifications there. So chapter 12, static postural assessment. And of course, you've got to know the three main postural distortion syndrome, the pes planus distortion, lower crossed and upper crossed syndrome. You got to know those forward and backwards. You got to know what muscles are involved with that, which muscles are overactive, which muscles are underactive. And you'll see that if you go into the Facebook group or you look up anything about the NASM exam, it's like, how do you memorize overactive and underactive muscles? We've already talked about it. You got to make some connections when you're looking through the material to help you understand. And they have the charts. They've done it for you. They're basically giving it to you and saying, memorize this, do it like this, understand this. So they make it easy. The overhead squat assessment, the OHSA, critical. You've got to know everything about how to do that assessment. Lateral view, front view, posterior view. Single leg squat assessment, same thing. If you notice, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, it's only 13 assessments, and then the pushing and pulling assessments. Push-up test, bench. Okay, so now we're doing actual performance assessments, vertical long jump assessments, right? Lower extremity functional test, or the left test, lateral speed. It's for lateral speed and agility. It's considered an advanced assessment. So you can get a question like, you have a client who's never worked out before, 50 years old, they have this, you've done these assessments. Which of these tests would you not conduct on this client? And it's just going to say the left test. You know, the overhead squat assessment. You're going to do the overhead squat assessment on everybody, but the left test you're not. Chapter 13. Now basically NASM says, now that you know all these assessments, now let's talk about how you develop a program for somebody. That's basically how they're doing this. They did a great job of sequencing the information. Basic assessments, postural movement performance assessments, right? You're going to do all those first. Now, client A, now let's go ahead and make a program for you. Now you got to understand how they put a program together. 5 fundamental movement patterns, right? Squatting, hip hinge, pulling, pushing, pressing. Remember, they want you to start, NASM wants you to start with their basic model, right? Which has 3 basic levels. And then there's different phases within the second level. And that's what they're going to systematically move you through. Keep in mind, when you get to chapter 13, there's a lot of information to memorize on the tables. What normally confuses people is they look at it just as this aggregate of information. The way you really want to be able to do it, or the way I suggest you do it, is you look at all the similarities in information. See if you can create, similarities in what appears to be disparate information. If you can pull and go, whoa, basically it's always this number of sets or this number of reps, no matter which phase I'm in with the OPT model, or it's pretty similar. That's one of the reasons I especially when I go through the chapter by chapter, I basically say, you're better off writing out your tables, on separate sheets of paper, and then you can kind of put them all. This is what I do. I put them all together and I kind of look and I go, well, those are almost the same. This is very similar. The only difference is this, this, and this. I can memorize differences if there's very few of them. Trying to memorize multiple similarities, why not just memorize the similarities as single units and then notice the differences between the different levels that you're at. So benefits of core training, balance training, this is all in chapter 13. Biometric training, SAQ, speed, acceleration, and change of direction, things like that. So SAQ training, right? Speed, agility, quickness, benefits of resistance training, and then the OPT model itself, the 3 different levels and the 5 phases. So level 1, look, you should have, believe it or not, in chapter 1 or chapter 2, one of those first chapters, they had the little pyramid, right? Stabilization, Stabilization, strength and power, right? Stabilization, 3 levels in the strength, and then 1 single level for power, right? There's 5 different phases, 3 levels. Stabilization phase 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and just you got to memorize those. The key to memorizing those is the repetition and the acute variables of training. And so again, if you're going through it, you got to memorize what the acute variables are: reps, sets, your volume, your intensity. All of those are what are known as acute variables of training. Those are the things that you're focused on during an actual training session, performing the actual exercise itself. How many reps you're going to do? How many sets? Why are you doing those? Because you have a goal of maximal strength or maximal power or just basic stabilization. That's what chapter 13 is helping you with. Chapter 14, flexibility training. Okay, this is where understanding some of the basic concepts of types of stretching is going to come in. Myofascial, foam rolling, right, versus static stretching versus active and dynamic stretching. You should know the main differences between those. Why do you do them at the beginning, or why would you do them at the end of a workout? And what's the actual technique for doing that? And by the way, I mean, half of those chapters are just pictures, technique pictures. That's great. You don't have to read anything. You can look at a picture. You can even redraw it for yourself. It could be very helpful. So chapter 14, high priority. Okay. Chapter 15, cardiorespiratory fitness training. And again, this is important because obviously helping people develop a strong cardiorespiratory system is of high priority. What are the components of a cardiorespiratory fitness, health related? So cardiorespiratory, muscular strength, muscle endurance, flexibility, body composition. Those are the 5 components to health related physical fitness. So you can see cardiorespiratory is generally at the top of the list, to be honest with you, because that's what's going to help you live a longer life. And then the FIT VP, again, you should know these things by heart. FITTE VP, right? So frequency, how often are you training? Intensity, right? So percent of max heart rate, this is cardiorespiratory. Percent of max heart rate percentages, right? And they'll explain that to you. What type of training are you doing? Do something that's fun and interesting that gets your heart rate up, right? How much time? 30 minutes, 60 minutes, 20 minutes? What's the time? The E part is enjoyment. Yeah, make it enjoyable. And then the VP, volume and progression. And that's the basic FIT VP principle. And there's your full explanation. You have to have a warm-up conditioning phase and a warm-down phase. Critical that you know those and know how those are performed and for what time. Do you warm up for 30 minutes? No, you're gonna fatigue a person if you warm them up for 30 minutes. It's 5 to 10 minutes max to warm somebody up. Okay. And then understanding ventilatory threshold cardiorespiratory training. Okay. And using VT, it's probably one of the most accurate ways to assess how we're going to do what's known as zone training, because that's really what it is. It's zone training. Zone 1, below VT1, where you can breathe and speak comfortably. Between VT1, VT2 is zone 2. And then zone 3 is anything above VT2 all the way up to max heart rate. And so understanding how you progress people, the ways you can increase intensity of training and helping people. Each phase or each level, the stabilization level, has a way to do cardiorespiratory training. The strength level has ways to do cardiorespiratory training. That's kind of the idea. And you got to change your mindset. If you don't do a whole lot of cardiorespiratory training, or you're not used to doing it specifically like this, you got to get into that mindset. Okay, chapter 16 is a moderate priority. This is core training. This is one of those areas where it's really important. We know it's important, but from a testing perspective, you got to remember, from a testing perspective, they only have 120 questions they can ask, and there's a whole lot of meat and potatoes from these other chapters, so they've got to decrease. it's all a priority for NASM when it comes to how many questions they're going to ask. How many questions are they going to ask from this chapter? Again, you know, it varies. Global core muscles are the more superficial muscles. And again, we talked about this with the global stabilization versus local stabilization system. Core training programs. What do core training programs look like? What are the reps and sets that are associated with that? That's what you're going to get in chapter 16. And then chapter 17, 18, and 19. Look, these are low priority for one reason only. They're low priority because they're simply not going to ask a whole lot of questions from any single one of these. It doesn't mean you're not going to see a question, because we see it all the time. I don't know any of their any of the tests that don't have at least one question from each one of these chapters. The question is are you going to see 3 questions from chapter 17 and 1 from 18 and none from 19? Or are you going to see none from chapter 17, 5 from chapter 18 and 1 from 9, something like that. So, you know, this is again one of those, you know, one of those balancing acts you have to deal with when it comes to how much time you have to study. So, chapter 17 is on balance training. Chapter 18 is on plyometric. And what I will say is that if you're going to see questions from these 3 chapters, chapter 18 is the one that they like to ask questions from: reactive training or plyometric training. So just know the 3 phases, the stretch shortening cycle, the eccentric loading, amortization, transition phase, and then the concentric or the unloading phase. That's one of the higher priority pieces of information. Recovery times for plyometric training as well, and progressions and regressions associated with that type of training. Same thing with chapter 19 with speed, agility, and quickness, SAQ training. Same thing. How do you do it? There's a lot of tables in there, but be smart with your study time. Okay. That's why we do this, is that you look and you say, I just don't have a whole lot of time. I'm like, well, okay, relax. Don't focus on them as much. But don't be surprised if you see questions from these chapters, right? It's just a balancing act, depending on how much time you have to study every day, and you know, whether you're 30 days out, whatever the case is. Now, chapter 20 gets a little bit more important, right? It's a little bit more important because it's the resistance training concepts, right? So let's make sure you understand chapter 21 and chapter 20, and then into 21. And by the way, chapter 21 is the high priority chapter, because this is exactly how you're going to use the OPT model. Chapter 20 is giving you the concepts now, definitions. Try and understand these as best you can. Spend some time in chapter 20 understanding what these definitions mean: metabolic specificity, mechanical specificity, resistance development stages. There's a lot of terms. They've got them all in the sidebars. You just got to memorize them. It's just the nature of the beast. What are your acute variables? What are your common training systems? You've got warm-up sets. Look at this. You've got single, multiple sets. You've got pyramids, supersets. Remember what I said at the very beginning. When you do your initial perusal, for those of you that are familiar with weightlifting and you've been working out for any length of time, you don't know what a superset is? Of course you do, right? You don't know what a giant set is? Of course you know what a giant set is. You would have gone through this and you would have been like, oh, chapter 2, I know that stuff. Great. Peruse right through it. If you already know it, obviously don't spend a whole lot of time on it, okay? Resistance exercise progressions, critical that you know those. If they're going to ask any questions from this chapter, you can guarantee it's going to be in some sense on those. Chapter 21 is high priority. Slow it down and spend some time here, because now what you're going to do is spend a lot of time on some tables, okay? So this is going to go deep into the phases. Phase 1 is stabilization. You got to memorize, by the way, you got to know the phases. Phase 1 is in level 1. Phases 2, 3, and 4 are in level 2, right? And then, of course, phase 5 is in level 5, power training, okay? So you got to spend some time understanding exactly, get in their heads. When they made the OPT training model, what were they trying to do? They were trying to simplify things. They were trying to structure actual programming. So we weren't just throwing things up in the air and saying, hey, should I do 5 sets today or 2 sets? I got this guy wants to gain lean muscle. What do I do? 8 reps or 20 reps? Well, that's what they've done is they've put it all together and they've used the science of exercise physiology and put it into this chapter. And that's why it actually makes a lot of sense. Now, chapter 22, moderate priority, because they are giving you some information related to the OPT model and some of the exercise modalities that go into it. So using medicine balls, kettlebells, right? Suspended TRX training, all of these are going to be explained. Sandbags, of course. Again, how much you memorize on this, just know what they are and how they're used for the most part. That's really all you need to know from chapter 22. And then chapter 23 is chronic health conditions and special populations. They kind of finish it off with, look, we've talked about average people, apparently healthy people. Now let's talk about those individuals that you're going to see for sure because we have chronic disease issues in this country. Here are those folks, and they're going to basically speak to each one of them. It's not the longest chapter, but it is an important chapter that you know because you will generally see some questions. So older adults versus individuals with diabetes, and of course diabetes and obesity are going to be your main chronic diseases that you see people with. And then they're going to hit you and give you explanation of obesity and diabetes and rheumatoid arthritis, osteoarthritis, and just be aware of those. So when you're going through them, it's not like they're giving you an extensive explanation of each one, but you should know the basic guidelines for training. Here is where, once again, with the tables that they're going to give you, make sure you can look and go, well, that's not very different than this, right? It may be a little bit different in the frequency, but you can memorize the differences. And so I've seen some students that will actually have large index cards or sheets of paper where they basically have all those tables and they're able to look through, make note of the differences between the different tables through the OPT model, and then memorize it that way. So that is your basic general study guide on NASM's 7th edition CPT, Certified Personal Trainer textbook, chapters 1 through 23. Keep in mind your main focus in all of this, when we talk about this, is knowing you've got to know how much time do you specifically have to do the study. The ideal scenario is that you have up to 60 to 90 days, at least an hour a day, which totals out to whatever number of hours of actual study time, right? I'm giving you a little recap here. But if you don't have that, if that ideal situation is not in your, in your scenario, in your life scenario right now, then you have to back things down and prioritize. And that's why you have low, moderate, high priority chapters, okay? If you don't have the time to do a full perusal, don't do a full perusal. Go directly into the study guide, boom, and hit all your chapters. But I'm just going to tell you, if you do have time, if you've got it, do it the right way, know the information, because it's really frustrating, when you don't pass and it was it was related to missing 2, 3, maybe a couple of questions on those chapters that you didn't get to look through, right? Because you didn't have enough time. So the suggestion is ideal. Get it all in. By the way, it's all great information to begin with. But if you can't, you have an actual strategy. BDU has given you the strategy and the resources to actually hone in and focus in on those areas that will help you to pass that NASM CPT exam on the first try. And we just wish you, everybody here from Body Design University, the best of luck sitting for your NASM exam.